Okay, if I can have everyone's attention, we'll go ahead and get started with our meeting. I'm going to ask Joe Palmer if he would open us in prayer, and then I will ask Captain David Swafford, United States Navy retired, if he would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everyone could please stand. And Joe.
Let's pray. Father, thank you for this gorgeous day and the blessings you pour on us that we don't even know. Although we do pray for some rain as well. Thank you for the ability to meet here today. Thank you for your Son who came and left the glories of heaven to come and be among us to pay the price for our sin. And I pray that you make us cognizant of that during this season. Bless our meeting today. Everything be for your glory in Christ's name.
Amen.
Salute, pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, well, thank all of you for coming today. And I will tell you this, that probably our Georgian guest will be here within the next maybe 10 minutes or so. And my wife's going to have them come through the buffet line, and we reserve these 2 tables for them over here. I think we certainly had a lot of fun with the lady that's staying in our home, and it's been quite a learning curve for both of us, going both ways, and we've enjoyed that. She speaks pretty good English, and that's very helpful. I think one of them may not, and it may be a little more difficult in that home with that host there. I hope you like this facility. It was one that we were always planning on possibly moving to because of its size, the numbers that it will allow, but that was kind of when we just got too large for Italianos, and it was kind of, we were on that borderline anyway. However, we didn't pull the trigger to come down here earlier because under the Project 80 or whatever it was called, these streets were all torn up and it was a horrible mess. That's done now. Since I was here last week, they put meters up, I understand, outside. And so the parking will be the most challenging thing that we'll have. And we're going to try to get, see if we can work out an arrangement with the parking lot across the street to the west and the north. There are 2 separate parking lots over there. The one to the south used to be owned by this facility or by Kimray, and you could park there and there was never a problem with that. But they sold that parking lot to that building, and as you notice all the roofing that's going on and things like that. You can park out behind. Any open spot behind here is free. That parking belongs to this facility as well as in the front, and so I'd urge you to pick those first if you can. And but I want to first off recognize some of our dignitaries that are here today. And we have brand newly elected State Senator Rob Stanbridge. Rob, would you stand? Rob and I have had quite a bit of communication over the last year, and he did not come for the interview process. There was a reason for that. But all of the conservatives and our Birch friends and all were all supporting Rob. They assured me, and I became convinced of that he was the solid conservative in that race, and he went on to win in a district that's a little touchy, called Norman. And you never even know how Republicans are going to go in Norman, some of them down there. So it was a little bit touchy there. And come on in, and these 2 tables here, and and we'll introduce these folks here in just a few minutes. I also want to introduce former state senator and gubernatorial candidate Randy Brogdon that's with us today. And then of course we'll have a couple of our elected officials that will be speaking here in just a few minutes. I think we'll probably mention the fact that I have our new membership brochures that are published or printed up now. They're over here on the free speech table. The table on the left is free speech. Anybody can put anything on the table they want. And then I had to handle the heat for things that are, a little bit free speech. And then, of course, we have our book table there. We don't sell those books, they're for donation of any amount. There are some recommended amounts, but sometimes people give more, sometimes people give less. We're actually going to give a packet to all of the Georgians that are here today, and I think they'll find that very interesting. If they will spend about the 8 hours it will take to go through everything in the packet, they will just know more about good government, the history of the United States, than 95% of all Americans. And but they all work for the government in the new Republic of Georgia, in one facility or another. And so they're very interested and they're here to learn about things. So I think that's very good. Our first speaker is going to be State Representative Jason Murphey. And Jason spoke to us about a year ago. And in his time, he kind of gave us an update of some of the things that had happened in government modernization and openness. And we talked about having him about once a year to give updates. And as I mentioned in my email, I saw a report recently, and I don't remember if it was an audit or just a report, but it detailed it's a very recent accounting of some of the savings that have occurred as a result of the government modernization that's gone on. And so Jason's here today to give us a little bit of a recount. And then kind of his counterpart in the Senate this past year on openness, transparency, and modernization has been Senator David Holt from Northwest Oklahoma City. So I've asked him to come, and kind of yesterday was the state government day for our Georgian friends. Today is their municipal or city government day, and because Senator Holt was the chief of staff for Mayor Cornett, he fully understands that relationship between those two. So I've asked him to come and talk a little bit about the relationship between state and city government, because as you know, cities can't do just anything they want to. They're somewhat regulated by both federal and state edicts. So at this point in time, please welcome State Representative Jason Murphey. Jason?
Okay, so as I understand it, I am the first speaker ever at this new venue, right? So I'm the original guinea pig. It's quite an honor to do that in this capacity before OCPAC. A year ago, I spoke to this group and I provided an update on some of the various initiatives to modernize state government. And the concept behind state government modernization, or our effort, has been that government should become smaller, more efficient, and more transparent. And frequently, we should attempt to apply technology to implement best practices for using innovative new ways to make that happen. Because as we all know, state government is so big, spending about $17 billion every year of your taxpayer dollars, that as the taxpayer, it's very hard for you to see where that money goes, if that money should be going where it's going, and once that money goes where it goes, if performance is bad or not. And so everything we can do to shrink that pie and work on taxpayer relief, shrink the size of the bill to you, and also give you the right, the absolute right to examine those expenditures, we must do. Technology enables us to do that in a way that we've never been able to do it before, and it's our responsibility as policymakers to apply those best practices. One of the inspirational moments to me was early on when OCPAC was meeting over at the Chinese restaurant on 39th, talking to the group and talking about the need for reducing the size of government. And it was very inspirational to see hope in people's eyes as they said, yes, maybe this can happen. And I very much understand the fact that for years, politicians have campaigned on reducing the size of government, and whether they be Republicans or whether they be Democrats, invariably what happens is the politicians go into the system and they become co-opted. And I know there are enough of you here that have seen that over the years, and you know that when you talk to the politician who has become co-opted, the politician who no longer believes in change or no longer believes shrinking the size of government is possible, you can absolutely see it in their eyes. You can hear it in their voice as they give all of the excuses that have been given over years and years and years, saying we just can't do that. And so I remember speaking to OCPAC on that day, and seeing in the people's eyes the hope. Maybe this can happen. And so as your state representative, one of the roles I want to play is to help restore that hope and show that, yes, it can happen. We can use new technologies to bring about those promises that have been promised for so long, but yet have been so unfulfilled for so long. So last year, I provided an update on some of those efforts, and I want to revisit that for just a couple of minutes here with you today. You may recall a year ago, I talked about how state government has for years engaged in very ineffective shared processes. These are the processes that all state agencies do, but they were always separated. One agency would do something another agency was doing, and they never realized the scale that they could realize should they combine those operations. And I talked about the insanity of if you were to have your own small business, and you divided that business into hundreds of small parts and told each one of those small parts to go do whatever you want. There is no coordination, there is no long-term strategy, there is no coherent attempt to leverage the scale of your business's spend or operations and maximize savings to the shareholder or to the owner. State government works exactly that way. It's divided into all of these different parts, and each part fights with the other part. They have territorial turf wars, and the thing that fuels those wars is your taxpayer dollar. And so every state agency will make the case that they need more money, and they will come to you for more. But rarely will they give up control to the other agencies and work together to save money. And so one of the areas we have worked very hard in is to streamline and maximize those shared services that all agencies engage in. Specifically, the largest cost saver we found is information technology. Those areas where state agencies engage in IT practices have historically been segregated by agency. Over the past few years, legislative leaders and Governor Mary Fallin have worked on a platform to start consolidating those operations. When I talked to you last time, I told you that those reforms were on pace to start saving $30 million each year. This year, I can say that that consolidation has moved forward, and we're now on pace to save $40 million each year because of that one single initiative. Last year, I told you that some of our work to make purchasing operations more efficient was saving about $8 million a year. Today, I can tell you that that operation is now saving an estimated $14 million a year. Some of our work to consolidate state agencies is now estimated to save $6 million a year. When you total that up, we're starting to talk about real money, even in government terms. And so every year we can now say, just because of these three foremost initiatives, we're now saving in excess of $55 million a year. Now it will be important on the back end for us as legislators to start line iteming out those savings and saying that that money should return to the taxpayer who overpaid their bill because of these terrible inefficiencies for year after year after year. We're bringing that to a stop. But we must remember where that money came from in the first place, and it must go back to the taxpayers in the form of tax reduction. We know that, and that's the second very difficult part of our job. Saving it was hard, and that was one thing. Now the money needs to go back to the taxpayer. Putting 55, give or take, $1 million in perspective is tough. It's just so much money. But one of the things that I would say is that even though that's just a small part of overall state spend, one way to look at it is that that money would probably amount to the amount of your property tax collections for those of you who live in Oklahoma County that go to county government each and every year. It's about the same amount of property tax money the entire county government here uses in 1 year. That starts to make you think. In my home county of Logan County, that would probably be the amount of property tax collections the county government gets for 10 years. That really makes you think. Of course, it's probably not smart for me to point out that would fund the federal government for about 10 minutes. But it's real money, and it's real work, and it wouldn't have been possible without the support of many in the legislative environment and the governor's office as well. So let me mention a couple of other recent successes and ways that the modernization initiatives have come into play recently. I'll mention two. One is the work to make state spending transparent. The idea is that you should be able, as the taxpayer, to go online through portals like data.ok.gov, which we've created, and see how every single dollar is spent, who gets it, and why they got it. we were using one of these modernization portals about 2 years ago, and we noticed that Oklahoma was paying money to Planned Parenthood. And of course, the concept was, why are taxpayer dollars going to Planned Parenthood? And so based on that finding, based on using one of the transparency tools to find that money, we started to work on legislation. And that legislation wasn't successful, and that was demoralizing. But we would later discover that once the state bureaucracy really looked at it, just a few months, maybe even weeks ago, they turned off that cash flow and they said, you know what, we're turning it off. And the reason we are is because it's very clear that cost per provider, per person served, is too high. And so looking at that, the state government was able to see a very inefficient method of spending and bring it to a halt. And that was, I think, if you trace it back, due to those transparency tools that are starting to expose inefficient and inappropriate methods of state spending. Here's another area where a major modernization initiative that we're now starting to see, I think, really have an impact on the debate inside the legislative environment. You may have heard me talk before about how state government has very little handle on the assets that it owns. Can you imagine if you had a small business, and as you ran that business, you didn't know what properties the business owned? Of course you cannot, because that's the free market, and a business that was ran that way would quickly go out of business. But in state government, it became very apparent that there are billions of dollars of assets owned by state government. They're not producing tax revenue, because after all, they're government properties, they don't produce tax. And they're just owned by all of these agencies who really want to possess this property. Finding a centralized accounting system to account for these was very difficult. And so we set about on the initiative to start to do that, to inventory the properties. But in more than that, working with Speaker of the House, T.W. Shannon, he crafted legislation that essentially says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to find the most underutilized of those properties, put them back in the free market and privatize them, and then use that money to meet deferred maintenance needs. A year ago, just about anyone would tell you that when we look at our real property situation, that bonds must be issued to take care of it, specifically the state capitol building and maybe others. Today, as we talk about these, we have a viable conversation about privatizing state properties to pay for deferred maintenance needs, and then reducing and eliminating the need completely for the state to issue debt to meet those needs. Just the fact that the discourse has changed to that new view is huge, because now we're starting to see a long-term plan coming together, very much opposed to the way that state government was always conducted. In the past, the system worked like this. Agencies claim their property. Agencies fail to take care of their property. When the property starts to crumble, the agencies say, hey, this asset is crumbling, either issue a bond and fix it, or all types of Armageddon-type results will happen. And that leveraged the legislature to put you, the taxpayer, in debt. And today, the government entities that issue debt have about $2 billion of debt on the books. All of state government with their business-type entities, probably more like $8 billion. Every year, the government entities must pay $200 million, give or take, of your taxpayer dollars to just pay off that debt. That restricts the hands of policymakers to have tax reduction and to invest as they should. And so if we can get away from that concept of spend, don't take care of things, and issue debt, and start to talk about shrinking the state's real size footprint, because their real property footprint isn't necessary like it used to be because of technology. Put those back into the free market, those properties back into the free market where they belong, and then start reducing that debt burden. I think that we start talking about some very responsible fiscal policies that allow for a smaller government, less taxation, and certainly less debt on future generations of Oklahomans. And that's our goal, and I think I can attest that the conversation is very much changing inside the legislative environment and going to that point of view. And I think that's why in the House of Representatives, when they put that vote to issue bonds for repair of the state capitol building on the floor, I think it lost by 80 to 20, 70 to 30 vote. That was a real turning point, and a turning point away from debt and bond issuance. So finally, I'll wrap up, but I do want to assure you that as we look towards the future, we have any number of other initiatives on deck and ready to go. We have a lot to follow up on and to build on, and we have to stay engaged in those reforms to ensure they are working. And when they stop working or when they're not being properly implemented, we have to, as responsible policymakers, revisit them. But we still have a lot of new ideas. There is a lot of energy in the legislature. The new members that are constantly being elected are bringing a lot of that to the table. And so over the next 6 years, if I'm honored to be reelected 2 more times before term limits hit, my goal is to work with those new generations of elected officials to absolutely institutionalize these concepts forever. And what I am finding is the new legislators, as they come on board, are very anxious to become a part of the effort. And I'm very optimistic about that. And certainly with leaders like Senator Holt in the Senate, he's absolutely been someone we could turn to and say, we've got this great idea, what do you think about it, and if you like it, will you help us? And his hand has been there to help us. And it's been greatly appreciated because I believe leaders like Senator Holt are doing the same thing over in the Senate. Next year, I will also be looking forward to working with the Senator again on open meetings and open records legislation for the legislature. So the public will finally have a legal right to query legislative records. And that will be an exciting project I'm sure we'll be successful with. With that, thank you so much for your attention. It's always an honor to speak to OCPAC and I'll return control of the charter.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, our next speaker is Senator David Holt. And Senator Holt, because of having served as Chief of Staff in city government, is very aware of its needs and its operations, and then he gets to the state senate, and there's quite a tie-in here, and so I've asked him to come and talk a little bit about that relationship between city and state government, and then on top of that, while Mayor Cornett was busy bringing the Oklahoma City or the Seattle Supersonics to Oklahoma City so they could be named the Thunder, David was his chief of staff, and he's actually written a book about that. I was kind of hoping he would bring those, and I want to buy one, I want him to sign it, and it's so much trouble. I was actually going to go to Full Circle Books today and buy one, but ran out of time. There's a story behind that I won't go into. But anyway, please welcome State Senator David Holt. David, thank you. Well, thank you for...
You're right, hold that far away. Thank you for having me, and a little higher. Perfect? All right. As he said, I served for 5 years as the Chief of Staff to the Mayor of Oklahoma City, serving at the local level of government. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I won't deny my remarks are kind of with the Georgian guests in mind, but hopefully the rest of you will find it interesting too. You know, I like to give context, and I think you need context. And first of all, everything that we operate as a government, whether it's at the city, state, or federal level, starts with our Constitution, written in 1789, and it identifies, you know, the federal government and the state government's powers. It doesn't mention local government, but in America, we very often speak of the 3 levels of government. There are other levels too. There's school boards and counties, and I'm not really... Yes?
We have a translator that translates.
Talk slower? Okay.
Just a little bit.
All right. So we have other levels of government, but most Americans at this point live in municipalities, also called cities. Those are ways we refer to urbanized areas. And so city government is as important as any government. It's also the government that in Oklahoma and in America at large provides the services that people use the most. For instance, water. The water you're drinking right now came through a tap that the city of Oklahoma City built pipelines to lakes around the state to bring to you. Picking up trash. People's lives would be pretty miserable pretty quickly if nobody came and picked up their trash. Police protection. Our police officers at the local level, the ones that people call when they dial 911, which is what we do in America when we have an emergency, it's your local city police who arrive. When your house catches on fire and you call the same number, those firefighters are employed by the city of Oklahoma City. Parks and other quality of life initiatives are also usually put forward by the city. So to put that in contrast, just to, again, I don't want to dwell on this, but just so you have a little context, the federal government traditionally, historically, was viewed as something that protected us from other countries, not Georgia, but from other countries. Yeah.
We're getting a little feedback because you're standing right underneath that speaker there.
Okay.
If you move over here just
Okay.
a little bit, I think maybe.
Okay. Am I perfect? Am I speaking at the appropriate volume level, speed, and in the right location? All right, good. Okay. Don't.
You're perfect.
Whenever anyone accuses you of not micromanaging,
I had you back
Okay. So anyway, now you'll hear certainly this group and many others complain that the federal government now does everything, anything that is conceivable that a government might do, the federal government is involved in. But the Constitution doesn't necessarily give them that power. It's just that the courts have found a lot of loopholes around the limits that we're putting on the federal government. Most of the powers are given to the state government. And the local city governments are creatures of the state. We are created by the state government. The state government is given very broad power. The state government is what creates the laws that regulate our lives, that make murder illegal, and those types of things. That flows from the state. The city is charged through its police force with enforcing some of those laws, and then, as I said, provides a lot of the services that people depend on most. The city also, in modern times, has been a mechanism for controlling the city's growth. We call that planning or zoning in America. You know, dictating what type of activities can occur in what types of areas of town. And then the city also, as I said, enforces really all of the state's laws, although the city itself creates very few laws of a criminal nature. But they will regulate some things like you know, what the fire protection, you know, that the fact that you see a fire alarm right there on the wall, that was probably a city code that was required by this building by the city of Oklahoma City. Things that the city does not do that maybe other local governments in America do include running schools. The city of Oklahoma City and all cities in Oklahoma do not run schools, but they will. You will find in other states around the country schools are run. We also don't provide social services, which I think is something that has made city government in Oklahoma kind of nice and free of certain arguments, because a lot of the argument that we have at the federal and state level is whether those levels of government should even be doing certain things at all. But at the city level, with I'd say with maybe quality of life projects that we can talk about in a minute aside, pretty much no one debates that somebody ought to bring water, somebody ought to fix the roads, somebody ought to put your house out if it catches on fire. Those are sort of non-debatable things. And the fact that the city has stayed out of social welfare programs has also meant that we don't argue over whether the city should be doing social welfare programs. They just don't. But again, other cities around the country have engaged in that type of activity. So in Oklahoma City, it's the largest city in Oklahoma. There are other cities around Oklahoma City that have their own mayors and their own governments. Your guide Kay lives in one of them, a suburb, Edmond. But, you know, the city being the largest city and sort of the center of the area tends to lead in a lot of ways. But it only provides services to the people that live in its own city. The other cities provide services to their own citizens. Our city is run by a mayor and a council. And though I said that we were creatures of the state, we are not, these people are not appointed and sent to us. Because that could be the case in other countries. I've seen that, you know, where someone comes from the central government as the mayor doesn't have any history there. We elect our own mayor and our own council. So we have a lot of autonomy apart from the federal and state government. Now, as Charlie alluded to, however, we are still subject to the regulations and laws that the state and the federal government create for us. Here's an example of that. In Oklahoma City, our policemen and our firemen are allowed to group together as a union, as a labor union. And they, every year, negotiate their contract and their salaries. These powers are given to them by the state of Oklahoma. The city could not take those powers away from them if they wanted to. And those powers give them the ability to demand higher wages. More for the rest of the room, I would like you to be aware that since 1994, the state of Oklahoma created the ability for those unions to negotiate their contracts through something called binding arbitration. Now, you elect Jason and I under the pretense that we control the state budget, and if you don't like the state budget, then you can, and Rob, you can yell at us about that, and there's at least some accountability there. At the city level in Oklahoma, if you don't like what police and firemen are making, it's unfortunately not really the mayor and council's fault. Because the state government has created a system where the police and fire unions, if they don't like what they're being offered, they go to an arbitrator and his ruling is binding. Why it's called binding arbitration. An arbitrator is almost always, this isn't written into the law, but it's almost always an attorney in Texas, for whatever reason. And that guy decides how your money is spent. And it is not my business as a senator what people get paid. But I think for you to be fully informed, you ought to understand that in Oklahoma City, the city of Oklahoma City, there's 2,000 police and fire officers, and they average in total compensation, that's salary plus benefits, they average $100,000 a piece. And that's because of binding arbitration. So I always say on this issue, we owe those folks all that we can, but not more than we can afford. And 2/3 of our city budgets, if not more, are typically going to salaries for those unionized employees. But what really matters is not what they get paid. If the people, elect officials that want to pay them that, so be it. What matters is who's making the decision. And right now, it's not your elected officials ultimately. And sometimes they take it all the way to the arbitration. Sometimes they give up early, unfortunately, because they just know they're going to lose. That's something we have to address, and we've tried the last couple of years. I thought that the change in power in 2010 meant that we would finally address this issue. But last year, a national think tank named Oklahoma the most anti-taxpayer state in the entire southern United States because of this. Very few states have binding arbitration in our part of the country. That is something you find in Massachusetts. That is not something you find in the Southwest and the South. They got it through after a failed House vote in 1994. They tried again the same year. They got it through barely. This is when Democrats were, an overwhelming majority. They still barely got it through. Our governor, then state rep, voted against it twice that year. But nevertheless, it became law, and Governor David Walters signed it. And we never had the opportunity to change that until recently. But we'll keep trying. But that's a very good example of how state government affects what the cities do. They would rather not probably have to pay people that much. They would like to compensate them appropriately. But they get put into a system by the state government where they do have to make certain tough decisions. Now, to kind of talk about the subject of my book that Charlie mentioned, it's kind of a case study of Oklahoma City. So I said all the things that Oklahoma City has done and does for its citizens, like streets, water, parks, fire, police. It is also, since about the early 1990s, it is engaged more actively in quality of life projects. These are non-essential. I mean, there's no denying that we can all survive and breathe and live our lives without a sports arena. But Oklahoma City has made the decision, along with its voters, who approved taxes, sales taxes, to pay for these things, has decided to build projects that have led to, undeniably, a pretty exciting time in Oklahoma City. And to the point where when you were told you were coming to Oklahoma City, I suspect you had heard of it. Because you knew that the Thunder played here, perhaps. I don't know. Who had ever heard of the Thunder before you came here?
Who are they?
Okay.
They
Yeah.
are looking for tickets. We'll try to know. We'll talk to you.
Good to know. Lakers, big game. So that was a new experience for us because in terms of America's population ranking, we're in the 40s. And major league sports teams sort of define a lot of cities' identities in America, for better or for worse. It's kind of superficial, but it's how young people certainly make a lot of their decisions about where they want to live. They want to be a part of something. And it's how international people perceive us, whether our city is big enough that they might see it on TV. We were always outside of that. We were just a little too small. But in the early 1990s, we began building some projects. And for this story, most notably, we built a sports arena. And then the New Orleans Hornets of the NBA had to relocate due to a hurricane that hit their city. And I'm glossing over this story because everybody else in the room knows it. But the team relocated here, and we were able to demonstrate that we could support a team. That team ultimately had to relocate back to New Orleans because that's where they were from. I read today they're going to be renamed the Pelicans, which I think that's a joke, but it's in the paper, so it must be true. So we ultimately had some businessmen here in town who spent $350 million and bought the Seattle Supersonics, not the Seahawks, by the way. I'm sure you've been told. That was in your email. You did say Sox a minute ago. The Supersonics of the NBA and ultimately, and therein lies the tale, but ultimately relocated that team here. And the voters again voted to put some more money into the arena and to build that team a practice facility. Those can be very contentious issues, and we may have time to get into it, but because not everybody, that is a private sector entity, these sports teams, but they become so ingrained with cities that, and they have so much leverage over cities because people really want those private sector entities, that they force often cities and states to do things that are somewhat distasteful, giving them money that they wouldn't necessarily give other private sector entities. But all in all, I like to focus on the positive. It's been a very good experience for Oklahoma City to have the team, and it's certainly raised our profile. But it's an example of, that was really city government driven, and it was really driven by our mayors, a succession of mayors. In Oklahoma City, we hire a city manager who operates all those things I just described, who kind of handles all the day-to-day operations of streets and water and police protection. And that sort of frees up our mayor, who is actually not paid really a living wage. He's paid sort of a stipend. He and the council, they don't do this full-time, although they certainly kind of do, but they're not paid to do it full-time. They are sort of they're sort of a board and chairman, if you can think of that in terms of maybe a company, whereas the CEO is our city manager. Not every city in Oklahoma even runs it that same way. Tulsa actually does not run that way. They elect a mayor who also operates the city. But in Oklahoma City, we have this sort of two levels of governance. The mayor and council hire the city manager. And I think that actually is a really good way to run things. I actually think that would be an interesting experiment to try on the state level. I would hire Jason Murphey as our state manager. But, I meant to say this, by the way, at the beginning, and this is on point. We'd have to wait 2 years. Right, Randy? But, no, I did want to say about Jason, there is nobody, well, maybe not nobody, but there are very few people who understand in our legislature the bureaucracy of the state as well as he does. And as he alludes to, sometimes knowledge becomes brainwashing, and people become defenders of that bureaucracy, but he is not. And to fight your enemy or change what you want to change, you have to know that. And he is such an excellent tactician on that stuff. So I rely on him very heavily. He says that I'm helping him. Really, I just like, what do you got? Okay, I'll do it. Can you give me enough? Tell me enough to get me through the committee. So because he is just amazing in how he knows all that stuff. So, but our difference. That's a little bit about how we all interact with each other on the city and state level, and maybe also a little bit about Oklahoma City's own unique history. With that, I guess, if they have any questions. Sure.
Okay, what I want to do first, if any of our Georgian guests have a question for either one, you get to go first. So it's open to you if you have a question. Any of you from Georgia. If you don't, I will turn them over to the Sharks. And but do you have a question, Tomas? Anyone have?
I don't have. Everything is absolutely clear. I just want to thank you for inviting us here. Wish you big success in the future. Thank you very much.
And actually, there is a Georgian that is playing in the NBA, and Tomas was familiar with that, and since they've been here, they really would like to go. If there is a way, and they're paying for tickets, but they'd like for them to be as inexpensive as possible. So if there's a way to go, you tell me afterwards here. So, Bob.
Representative Murphey, thank you very much for what you're doing and the efficiencies gained and the improvement of how our state government operates. But I'm kind of vexed, and I'm hoping you can address this. I worry about the sin nature of man coming in and somebody abusing the system. The free flow of information, the fact that it's further centralized, the information about citizens being used by the government or people in the government against the very citizens it's meant to support. What kind of safeguards or mechanisms, or how have you done that as you've improved everything, the information flow through IT? What are you doing about that aspect of it?
So the point made is that when you have all of this inefficiency, you naturally make it difficult for one person to potentially flex their muscle and, say, consolidate data sources or create an evil empire, a Gene Stipish empire, if you will. Oh, wait, I just pointed to the history of how a powerful politician took advantage of the chaos to their benefit. What if we craft a system that functions through transparency and empowers the average citizen and the media, the press, the think tanks, the OCPAs of the world, the web developers who can write the products to expose to the public when evil occurs, when the sin nature of man takes over and they're using your taxpayer dollar to fund it? That's what we work on. Specifically with IT issues, information technology issues, it is important to note that our efforts to consolidate IT functions are not efforts to consolidate databases. It's important that that data be segregated. I would make the point to you that our initiative to cut the size of government is an attack on the most aggressive government data grab there is, and that is the personal income tax. That is when you complete that form and you tell the government all about you, and you send it to the tax commission. You know what? They do that in South Carolina too. In South Carolina, their coordinated IT operation decided we need to mitigate the security risk that is presented by the fact that the South Carolina Tax and Revenue Department controls all this data. And the head of that department said, we're not going to do it. Thanks, but no thanks. And just a little after that, hackers broke in and took 8 gigs of data, some of which was unencrypted. And so all of a sudden now, imagine the horror of the average South Carolina resident who is forced by the government to submit a return. That return is not secured because of the incompetence of the particular bureaucracy who won't use IT professionals to secure the data. And now you have to worry about your tax return, your medical records, whatever it is, being posted on the internet for all to see, being sold to hackers for them to exploit your identity. Here's the scary part. We've consolidated about 1/3 of state agencies, and the findings related to ICT security are amazing. One state agency has point-of-sale terminals, had no firewall, and at some point, every one of those point-of-sale terminals had been compromised. Their network was under the influence of hackers from China, and there were, I think, out of the 11 security points that were judged, they failed every single one. Didn't even have a firewall in place. There are amazing security deficiencies the public has no idea are going on when you relate to government and give them your data. This particular reform is slowly getting to those and mitigating them. And aside from the cost savings, security and protecting your identity was the major driver for the reform.
I might mention one thing. Jason puts out a weekly email, and it's also picked up and published in the newspapers in his district. He recently wrote an article on kind of what he just mentioned, and I noticed that Mike McCarville picked it up. Was it your entire article that he put on the blog? Mike McCarville picked it up. If you can go to McCarville's blog, I think you'll see Jason's article written there, and it's a very impressive article. So, someone else? Yes.
Quick question for Jason. Why do you have to call tax money spent an investment by the state?
Answer that one.
Can you add more context to the question?
You mentioned something about investment, that the state made investment earlier in your comments. I don't remember the exact quotation, but I got the impression that you were talking about the state spending tax money and you called it an investment. I'm assuming you meant an investment by the state. But,
I'm not sure without knowing the context.
What he's talking about. Quite often when the Democrats are proposing increased funding, they say we've got to make an investment in something, so they're calling the new tax revenues an investment, which may not be an investment at all. I think that's what you're saying. Yes, sir.
I just think that terminology is misleading and wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like a Democrat.
Don't do it.
You can see when he's stumped, he just won't answer. Okay. Someone else? Anyone else? Anyone? Okay, David, back in the back.
You mentioned the inventory of state properties and whatever. There were several articles in the newspaper, but there's never been a conclusion to that published. Have we ever completed that inventory, and do we know what we own?
So with each of these reforms, we have to always attach the accountability mechanism.
What is our investment? I mean, what's our
I didn't say that again, did I? So now I've got to add the I word to my list of don't say that word. Great. All right, so with that accountability, each reform, whether it be IT, purchasing, or inventory, the thought process is we've mandated it, but how do we know that the bureaucracy will ever even do it? So let's have a reporting mechanism. The reason I was able to talk about those IT mitigations was because there was a report on it. And every quarter, the IT consolidation has to give us a report, and we have to know what they're finding. Same thing with purchasing, and with the property inventory, we said you got to put it online. So if you go to data.ok.gov and you go down to about the 40th posted data set, it's a very innocuous looking data set called state property. If you click on that, you can see it for yourself. It's about 200,000 items now, but you can see as it's coming together, the public can now see what we own, that they own, and that's a very important component of that particular reform. So go to data.ok.gov, click down to about the 40th give or take data set, and look at the data set called state property.
Quick follow-up on that, what happens with that inventory then, or the different agencies forced to look at it, who determines whether it's a good property to own or whether they need to get rid of it?
So part of the reform, it was sponsored by Speaker T.W. Shannon, it requires that central services officials isolate and identify the 5% most underutilized properties. And once they do that, the onus, of course, will be on the legislature to say, let's do it, let's privatize those properties. But we're asking shared services officials to identify, and then we've got to hope the legislature has the political will to say, let's privatize those properties and meet deferred maintenance needs and avoid debt.
What kind of teeth do you have in the requirement? Getting budget money maybe?
As we look at it, it will be up to us to act on it, but the central services officials are mandated to do it. And this gets back to the point I made earlier, which is we have to stay engaged in each one of these particular reforms, and that comes with the transparency requirement. So let's say the central services officials say, you know what, we can't find any. Well, we've required it, so we'll follow up. And two, it's transparent now. So you can go online and say, do you really need that vacated fire watchtower on some mountain in southeast Oklahoma? And of course, we haven't used it since the 1940s, so the answer is no, we don't. And that's pretty obvious. And so the transparency gives us the ability to find some of those obvious issues.
About two more questions. First, Thomas, and then I'll come back to you.
Senator Holt, can you kind of get into how the owners of the Thunder came into being, how that ownership team came together, and how they were able to finagle taxpayer money to help fund their venture?
Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, they're all just business leaders in Oklahoma City, so I think they've just known each other, if that answers the first part of your question. The second part of your question, so there were two primary incentives. I mean, you could go back to 93, and you could say building the arena itself was sort of an incentive, but then you got two major things that were done in 2008. Improvements to the arena funded by a 15-month, 1 penny sales tax in Oklahoma City, and a practice facility. And so I guess you asked how they did that. So they basically came to the city and said, we're not going to move here unless you go to the voters, because that's how it has to be done at the local level, and ask for, these to finance these projects. And so that's what happened. In March of 2008, the voters of Oklahoma City approved it, I think like 64 to 36, to have a 15-month sales tax for those two projects that are publicly owned still. The other thing they did was they went to the state, sort of separately from their negotiations with the city, and they said, we're not moving to Oklahoma if you don't include professional basketball in the Quality Jobs Act. I would say that's probably even more contentious. The first thing is infrastructure, at least, I think people get that you have to have a basketball arena, but the second thing is more contentious. I would say what they used, and you can agree with this or not, as their moral justification was that they did, and this is true, they had to pay the NBA $30 million in a relocation fee that was distributed to all the other teams. And then they had to pay the city of Seattle $45 million in their settlement to leave Seattle and come here. And that added up to $75 million, sort of above and beyond their normal sort of business costs. And they felt like that should be compensated for them by the state. And that's about $75 million is about what that quality jobs benefit amounts to. So, I mean, that's, you could probably have hours of interesting debate, but that's how it happened.
Last question.
Jason, just using this topic of yours with governments performing IT and setting things as an example, and your various state entities that after you guys pass legislation, turn around and tend to write administrative code related to things. I've been on all levels of state government, and it's a very frustrating thing that oftentimes you guys pass laws to say do X, and then code gets either written that it doesn't have the authority of law, against these state entities operate under their own guidelines that they make up. Do we have a problem with that? I'm using your topic, but it relates to the vast majority of things, whether it's Department of Transportation on highway bills or other things like that.
This has always been a touchy subject with legislators as well, and the idea is that there's an administrative code that state agencies put forward to their rulemaking authority that in many ways has the effect of law. And so the legislature will pass a law, and then the agency will propagate code to fill in the gaps or to add all of their own definitions to it, whatever the case is. Way back when, I think the legislature had to take a proactive approval of that code making. So if an agency puts forward some complicated code, the legislature would have to say, okay, that's okay, we'll vote on it. And then you as the taxpayer would have that transparency, which I believe is very important. Because when an agency makes code that has a fee increase in it or that hurts the taxpayer in some way, or there's strong environmental regulations that are not conducive to business environment, then it is very much a punitive effect, and the legislature should have to take action on that to be held accountable. I think the thought in the legislature is that we're going to move back to that model. We have moved back to the model that says if there's a fee increase in it, then the legislature has to take action. And so we're making progress there, and more authority is coming back from the agency to the legislature, and when that happens, it comes to you as the voter too, because then you can hold your individual legislator accountable. That's very important.
Thank you, Jason. To our Georgian friends here, we're going to give you all a gift. And I have here in my hand a book that was written in 1884. We have two individuals that are absolutely heroes in the settlement of the West. One was Daniel Boone and the other was Davy Crockett. And Crockett was a congressman from Tennessee for a period of time before he left that position and went to the Alamo, and he was killed at the Battle of the Alamo. Anyway, out of this book is a little chapter, a little excerpt. And this is very short, easy to read. It's called Not Yours to Give, and it's about when Davy Crockett was a congressman from Tennessee. Also involved in this is a fairly short article called Republics and Democracies. And this is really the definitive article defining the difference between those two and explains why our founding fathers really hated democracies. You may not know that. That's why they created our government to be a republic. This is a book written in 1849 by a French economist and statesman by the name of Frederick Bastiat. And I think that this is the second most important book anyone will ever read. I'm a Christian, so I think the Bible is the first most important. But in this short little 80 or 80 less page book here, what Bastiat does, he shows you where do you draw the line to understand what are the proper functions of government versus those that are improper. And he shows that when government gets out of its proper realm, it participates in what he calls legalized plunder. In other words, government makes legal what is actually morally wrong to do. And so I urge you to look at that. We also have a pocket copy of the United States Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and all of the amendments to the Constitution. Two other items here, and I hope your DVD players in Georgia will play this kind of a DVD. But the first one here is just 29 minutes long. It is a classic. It does the best job of anything I've ever seen to clearly define different types of government, different types of economic systems, what works, what doesn't work, and the importance of morality for liberty. And the final one is on economics. A total of about 8 hours worth of viewing and reading. If you choose to access all of this material in your little packet, once you've finished, you will understand more about good government and economics than probably 90 to 95% of all Americans. And so we give this to you, and with great pleasure, thank you for being here today. Next week, we're going to have 2 speakers. The first one will be Liddell Patterson. Liddell not only is a missionary, but he's created an orphanage in Lesotho, Africa. Lesotho is a little island country inside of South Africa. Its adult population was almost wiped out because of AIDS. And so the nation was left full of orphans, and he has been over there for a number of years creating a ministry and an orphanage to take care of these children that had no parents. In addition, we will have another speaker, but this is going to be a mystery speaker, and the reason being, the communist country that this speaker is working in would be so dangerous for this speaker's name to be known or be on YouTube, which we will not film next week's meeting. It would be a risk to this speaker and a risk to this fledgling ministry. So I will not publish the name or anything in the email, but know that we'll have 2 speakers next week. And so thank you so much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this meeting today. And if you have time, greet these Georgians before you go. Thank you so much. See you next week.